Hey there, everyone. Today I would like to explain what posthumanism is. And in order to do that, I have to explain what humanism is first. This is going to entail a historical and conceptual overview of the development of Enlightenment ideas about rationality, about personhood, about ethical subjectivity. And this is going to bring us to some of the contemporary discourses where posthumanism is most used, particularly feminism, postcolonialism, and postmodernism. I'm going to be showing you a few kind of arbitrarily chosen works out of the massive list that I could choose here to showcase some of the ways that posthumanism is most productively used. And this will hopefully give you a very holistic understanding about what humanism is and why posthumanism is skeptical of some of these ideas about humanism. Now, as I just said, we're going to have to go back to humanism first and really get a grasp of what it is before we can understand posthumanism's critique. Because the post in posthumanism, like postmodernism, can be a temporal historical marker, as in that it simply came after humanism. But more charitably and more holistically, it is a sort of radical critique contemporaneous with ideas of humanism, or the same thing for postmodernism with modernism. So really, it is in the midst of humanist ideas and trying to critique them without superseding them by some sort of ideology of the subject, of history, of truth, of essence. It's not trying to supplant humanism by some sort of other synthetic and systematic account of ontology or of epistemology. Instead, it is simply trying to critique and problematize a lot of the categories established by humanism. And humanism, put most simply, privileges the human subject when it comes to ethical decisions. Humanism says that, well, there is something particularly unique and essentially different about humans compared to all other animals and all other entities. There are particular faculties and capabilities and outlooks and questions unique to the human experience and to the human essence that makes them privileged ethical subjects. And what do I mean by ethical subjects? Well, in ethics, whenever we want to make a decision about anything, we have to make it with regard to a particular entity. Is something good or bad, good or evil, helpful or of hindrance to a particular entity? And that entity in question is our ethical subject. In our discourse of ethics, who do we see as worthwhile of constituting a subject against which an ethical decision and for which an ethical decision can be made? And humanism comes about during the Enlightenment, the flourishing of the natural and human sciences, when we are coming up with ways of establishing systematic inquiry into the universe. And this creates a sense of privilege among humans, that we are uniquely capable of accessing the truths of the universe, that we have a systematic method by which to eliminate the biases by which we go about this investigation. So we have the scientific method that allows us to make hypotheses, allows us to test empirical matters, allows us to prove or nullify, really only nullify. There is no proving a hypothesis. There is only failing to prove it wrong. And this way allows us to substantiate a body of truth that seems to lend credence to a particular capability and a particular specialness to the human subject. And in this way, while the Enlightenment is in many ways problematizing Christianity, problematizing ideas of faith, for example, and valuing reason over faith, in many ways, humanism is still beholden to Christian ideas. For example, the essential specialness of humans in the eyes of God is replaced by the special place of humans in the eyes of scientific rationality, and really in human discourse created to valorize the human subject as unique. And it might sound like they've got something here because, for example, we humans have very unique cognitive capacities. We have faculties that allow us to do a lot of things, question a lot of things, and think about a lot of things in certain ways that is unheard of in the animal kingdom. But the animal kingdom is crucial because we are still animals. And all the way back to Aristotle, we have a theory about what makes humans distinct from other animals in such a way that they are still animals. Well, Aristotle says we are rational animals. That's what makes us unique, is we have this capacity for rationality. And this is at the heart of the humanist vision of the human subject, is the human subject is fundamentally rational. And what does rational thinking mean, right? What distinguishes rationality from other sorts of thinking? And one of the things that we're going to find as we proceed through this lecture is that this, among all the other categories established by humanism, is one of the weakest and most flimsy of the categories. It is incredibly difficult to define what rationality is. And in fact, later in this lecture, I'm going to be talking about Deborah K. Heikes's Rationality, Representation, and Race, where she challenges this very notion of an objective, empirical understanding of the idea of rationality and the implication it has had on feminism and postcolonialism and, to a certain extent, postmodernism in her work. Because the idea of rationality or reason seems to speak to some sort of unique capacities we have. The ability to detach ourselves from the immediate instinctual matters at hand and recede back into an abstract thought space and logically conclude certain matters, right? Instead of simply inducing ideas about the world, taking matters of fact and predicting what might happen, we can also deduce ideas. Using logic, pure and simple, so the philosophers say, we can abstract ourselves away from our empirical, material, social, cultural situation, and we can have some sort of objective, rational appraisal of questions of truth, of essence, of knowledge, of categories, of identity, etc. And posthumanism is really going to be questioning what are the implications of this setting up of the human subject. Because the way that we get the subject portrayed to us by humanism, we have a sort of abstract entity. It is not an entity that is historically contingent, that is perspectival. Rather, it is some sort of essential trueness of humanity that has always remained, that will always remain, just because it's a categorical definition, right? It applies to a category itself. If we create a categorical distinction between entities, and then we define the relations between these entities, then any true statement we make about the entities defined by the schematization we create is, of course, going to be a priori true. It's going to be true about the subject no matter what seems to happen to them, because the way that we've defined them is such that they recede back from history and from contingency and flux and change. And instead, we seem to get this privileged access to the truth of entities. And as the Enlightenment progresses and we come out of the Enlightenment and we come into the truly modern 20th century and into the 21st century now, there has been a lot of sustained critique against the humanist conception of, for example, the essential valorization of the human subject as the exclusive locus of ethical decision-making. The idea that what we are essentially or even exclusively, for some humanists, concerned with in our ethical decisions is humans. And this is maintaining an exclusivity, an exceptionalism of humanity that can be found in the Bible, with the command to be fruitful and multiply, that we are unique creatures made in God's image, unlike any other being. And the post-humanists come on the scene and they say, okay, as with all good disciplines, it starts with the question, how do you know? How do you know that the human subject is essentially constituted by rationality? And one of the ways that this happens is by really questioning, what is rationality? What does it mean to be essentially sane, logical, concise, right? All of these aspirations to the Enlightenment and to the Enlightenment style of thinking are really questioned, and we can see this coming from a number of different disciplines: postmodernism, postcolonialism, and feminism. And all of these are going to be tackling and critiquing humanism and therefore oftentimes invoking posthumanism or creating a posthumanist philosophy in the process. And one of the people that I want to start with is Michel Foucault. And in Madness and Civilization, he's really tackling this problem of rationality, of reason, the other way around. He wants to, as he says, write a history of that silence, which is madness, which is the opposite of reason, which is the scapegoat against which reason is defined, and therefore the very scapegoat against which the human subject is erected. And like all of these thinkers, the question that is being asked, the real impetus that creates the need for posthumanism, is who is being excluded? Who is being sidelined to their detriment? And Foucault says that, well, in fact, when we have this concept of rationality, which is a historically contingent artifact and is embodied in institutions like the police, like the church, like the state, like prisons, all of these are ways to code bodies in such a way that an effect seems to, in fact, be a cause which preceded what is a historically contingent thing. So it seems that we have always been this way, that we have always been rational. And Foucault really wants to show that, in fact, any of these concepts like rationality, these are post hoc creations, attempts to systematize phenomena that go beyond any one system. And humans are this way. Entities are this way, which is exactly the problem with human, because there are tons of discourses within which we can question the very category of human. For example, in the abortion discourse, at what point does someone start to become a human? Even when someone has human genetic information, there are thinkers who have made very persuasive arguments that the start and end point of a human life is not so clear. There are, in fact, a lot of biological and conceptual lines that are being crossed and molded that we need to consider in this discourse. And Foucault is trying to do a similar thing, questioning the lines that we've drawn in the sand and shown that, in fact, they are lines drawn in the sand, not that were instituted there by some divine authority or by some abstract notion of reason working through history like Hegel is going to be talking about. Therefore, he says, doubtless the unity, that is, of the human subject, is comprised in its rigor and in its totality. But it is fissured, it turns out, along lines which do not abolish it, but divide it into arbitrary sectors. So we arbitrarily truncate the possible definitions or the possible entities which could be considered constituting a human definition, and we arbitrarily cut them off, and we say that they don't fit in our definition. They're some sort of edge case, and Foucault wants to show that those edge cases are the greatest problem for a humanist conception of the human, or of rationality, or of truth, or essence. He says that in madness, the totality of soul and body is parceled out, right? In this sort of attempt to define the mad, to define the other, and therefore supersede them and truncate them into our discourse, to hold them in our grasp and say that we really know that we are sane, we know what rationality is, we know what a human is. Not according to the elements, as it parsed out, which constitute that totality metaphysically, but according to figures, images, which envelop segments of the body and ideas of the soul in a kind of absurd unity. Right? So we create ideas and we sort of pell-mell, bric-a-brac, try to bring them together to form a coherent, exclusive, and essential definition of what the human subject is. But he says that these are fragments which isolate man from himself, but above all from reality. Fragments which, by detaching themselves, have formed the unreal unity of a hallucination, and by very virtue of this autonomy, impose it upon truth. So truth for Foucault is not some sort of abstract entity like reason or like the human as it is viewed by the humanist. Instead, it is something imposed by taking matters of facts, by taking the fragments of the world and abstracting them from their situations and creating in this ideal realm, the likes of which thinkers like Kant or Hegel or Descartes are going to be working in, and says that here I have found the unity of the human subject. But Foucault wants to say, of course you want to say and feel like you found the unity of the subject because it comforts you. It makes it seem like you're not the problem, like you have no problems, like you are essentially special. And Foucault says, no, we need to investigate how it is that the human comes to view themselves as human and what are the implications of that category. And the very notion of categorization is critiqued in Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, which is greatly influenced by Foucault, by Deleuze, by Derrida, by other post-structuralist, postmodernist thinkers. And in this, she really wants to understand the implications of this categorization of people and of concepts like rationality to the understanding of feminism. And she says that the premature insistence on a stable subject of feminism, that is, the woman, an essential category, just like the human, or rationality or reason, understood as a seamless category of women, inevitably generates multiple refusals to accept the category. Right? So we refuse to accept people who call themselves women, who attempt to enact a womanly life, who attempt to make for themselves what it means to be a woman through their actions, precisely by the very invocation and the very implementation of a category. By insisting on this essentialist understanding of the human, of the man or the woman, right, to go for the feminist understanding of gender as deeply important to this humanist discourse and to our post-humanist critique, we really need to see that the human is something malleable and something that we need to accept beyond any one category. She says, as a question, do the exclusionary practices that ground feminist theory in a notion of women as subject paradoxically undercut feminist goals to extend its claims to representation? Right? Because feminism claims to be able to represent and to speak with the voice of women. It is a discourse uniquely situated to valorize female voices, to undercut patriarchy. But Butler questions, to what extent are we really doing this if we are essentializing our very notion of women? If instead of letting women sort of burgeon as their own liminal field with their own edge cases that enhance and beautify the category, if we try to sanitize and essentialize women, we do this only to the detriment of women. Because the real question of Butler and thinkers like her is, on whose terms do these categories get decided, and to whose detriment? Therefore, to go back to Deborah K. Heikes's book, Rationality, Representation, and Race, she really wants to understand this concept of rationality, which I've been talking about, and understand it as something liminal, that it has to be an open category, capable of being contested. And therefore, this moves us beyond the unitary, hyper-conceptual, idealist notion of the human subject and of rationality, which would ground the human subject, that is the core of humanism, and moves us into posthumanism. She says that the model of rationality should shift, in all likelihood, to something closer to a quantum observer, whose act of observation is itself an integral part of the world. A rational faculty that fails to take into account various human interests and the ways in which the world assists or limits us in pursuing these interests is not a faculty that we can continue to understand as rational. It goes against the very understanding of some sort of privileged discipline if it is going to truncate humans in its very attempt to define them, right? Unquestionably, rationality is a much broader, much more value-laden, and much more egalitarian concept than what the moderns would allow it to be, and therefore what the humanists would allow it to be. This is important. It is a value-laden category, concerned with the interests of the observers who formulate it. We can see this in Quine, for example, in his epistemology. We can also see this in standpoint epistemology, where we have an attempt to understand any epistemological criteria and scheme as having more to do with the observers and the formulators than the content observed or formulated. That it is equally important to consider the methods and the ways and the channels by which we come to our knowledge, and therefore the categories and ideas which precondition our attempt to understand any knowledge of, for example, the human subject. She quotes Helen Longino here, who explains that what the postmodernists and the feminists resist is the idea that there is a template of rationality in which all discourses fit, a template that dissolves the barriers of locality, a universal language into which all statements form local contexts, can be translated and bought into logical relations with each other. One person's rationality, then, is another's tyranny. And that is the point of Foucault, that just like, for example, postcolonial theorists have considered about terrorism, one person's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. In the same way, one person's rationality is another person's tyranny. It is an attempt to impose a category, a way of thinking, a way of being. A perfect example of this is in linguistics and in sociolinguistics with African American vernacular English. This is more colloquially called Black English, and it is predominantly spoken by Black Americans. And it has often been historically perceived as a deficient secondary form of English, something closer to a patois, not a dialect of its own, with its own proper rules, its own distinct forms, but rather as a derivative and deficient form that is trying to aspire to the major discourse of proper English. But contemporary sociolinguists have gone to great lengths to show that African American vernacular English is its own unique domain of speech. It has its own rules internal to its system, its own phonology, its own grammar rules, its own questions of context in which you're allowed to use certain diction and when you're allowed to present yourself and speak in such and such a manner. And this has to be truncated when brought into the majoritarian discourse of, for example, a big city and you try to get a job at a big corporation and you speak African American vernacular English. It is expected of you that if you want to get the job, that because of the way African American vernacular English has been perceived as ghetto, that you code switch to the major proper English dialect. You speak with a different accent, with a different cadence, with different grammar rules. You accede to a different way of speaking, a different way of constituting yourself as a subject, therefore, in order to privilege another discourse and allow yourself to fit into that discourse. So we can see that in order to try to maintain this image of linguistic unity or wholeness, which the same would apply for the idea of the human subject or of rationality, we in fact have to truncate a lot of humans. We have to take people on the margins, the subalterns, so to speak. And their voices have to be either entirely quashed or severely truncated in the process of accommodating them or really beating them down into a discourse which they are always subservient to because of the cultural, social facts of the world in which they live. And this is something that post-colonial scholars have tried to point out, is that in fact ideas of race, of the status politically of am I a colony of some sort of major European power, these are important qualities when it comes to the way that the human subject has been historically developed and theorized. Because, for example, this has historically excluded not only women from the category of subjectivity, because, for example, going back to Aristotle, he doesn't really know what to do with women. He wants to insist that they have some sort of inferior cognitive status, in fact, some sort of inferior ontological status, that they are not quite all the way human like men are. They're not animals, but they're not really reasonable. They're tied to emotions and the bodies and transients and all this. So even Aristotle doesn't really know what to do with women, and women have long been excluded from the humanist discourse. But post-colonial scholars want to add that also racial minorities have been excluded. And this is to their detriment because this has, for example, facilitated and valorized colonialism and its exploitations by saying that, well, no, we're going, in fact, to civilize. And there we see another aspect of the humanist conception of the human subject historically has been notions of civility. That there is some unique decadence and highness of human culture and societies that gives them the right to punch down on other entities, on other communities of those entities that don't fit our categories of sophistication, of advancedness, of evolvedness. And this has historically been the case for communities that have been plundered by colonialism, that have been exploited, as they're not seen as fully capable of making their own rational decisions. And therefore, someone needs to paternally step in for them, needs to intervene on their behalf and be a human for them because they cannot be it of their own volition, because they apparently don't have the cognitive capacities to do this. So this has been, of course, with scientific racism, historically attached to methods of scientific discourse, showing that science is not free of value-laden concerns. It is historically contingent to, and it develops through various paradigms, as people like Kuhn have showed. And therefore, post-colonial scholars really want to critique the way that the deployment of the human subject as a legitimating mechanism plays out in culture. And one last way, I think this is a really interesting case, is the way that this applies to cybernetics. A really wacky post-humanist text is Shannon Bell's Fast Feminism, in which she combines feminism with cyber politics and cybernetics and postmodern concerns and transgressive literature like Bataille and de Sade. And she takes this to some very interesting conclusions because she's also concerned with sex studies and the philosophy of pornography and things like this. And in her book, she wants to center the body as a site of resistance on which and through which and by which feminist scholars and really feminists in general, whether or not they're scholars, can really challenge humanist reductions of the female body. For example, one of the ways that this has happened in discourses around sex is that females have the passive position and males the active position. And she shows in this book how this has been historically tied to a scientific discourse which has understood male versus female ejaculation in ways that valorizes certain active capacities of the man and seems to valorize some sort of or confirm some sort of biological essentialism about the male dominance versus female subservience. And she really wants to challenge this through the body and through a very strange and very evocative and expressive understanding of female ejaculation. And here's a little taste of what's in this book. She speaks of the physiological fact that male bodies and female bodies can both ejaculate and have physiological erectile tissues that can harden, solidify, and mollerize into a phallus, leaves the body a surface, speed of having, that is, of doing, and of activity. So what she really wants to show is that the capacities for both bodies to actively have an erectile response. She shows how this erectile response is inside the body for females and outside the body for men. This is a small way by which we can contest the idea that, for example, the female is just a mere receptacle for men, right? And that she is therefore a purely object-like, autonomous creature compared to the autonomy of the human man. And you can see that even in the way that I just sort of formulated that, trying to take on the mindset of this sort of frankly bigoted perspective, I talked about females as a creature versus men as humans. So we can see that this is the sort of dichotomy that is going to be established. And one of the writers that you might be interested in for really challenging this is William Burroughs. In The Soft Machine, he's really content on showing the body itself, like Shannon Bell is trying to show, and to a certain extent like all these other theorists are trying to show, as a site of contestability by which these categories, these sort of palliative attempts to soothe humans' worries about their contingency, about their mortality. Burroughs really tries to explode those from the inside, show how the body is capable of change, capable of radical metamorphosis. And these are all sort of different ways at coming at the human subject and giving it a really radical critique that allows us to still live in our bodies. It's not violating this idea that there are entities which we happen to call human. It's questioning the category of human precisely because it's not just a category. It is a corollary of institutions. It is a weapon and tool of power used to make certain people, like racial minorities, like women, like non-human animals, like the environment, to be excluded. And one final discourse that I might mention is ecocriticism. This is an area of literary criticism particularly concerned with the ways that humans and non-humans interact with spaces, with environments. And it's a really, of course, eco-conscious domain and discipline. And post-humanist scholars have often used ecocriticism to their advantage to show that humanism has historically neglected the environment, that the environment is there for humans, there for us to use to fruitfully multiply, and that therefore really what matters the most is how this is of utility to humans. And ecocriticism challenges this and says, well, why are we only assuming that humans are the primary locus? For this very life to exist, which we call human, it is constantly dependent upon the environment. The fact that I am an entity which I can even call, even preliminarily, human, requires that I am breathing in oxygen from the environment around me, that I am exchanging heat with the environment in order to thermoregulate, that I am consuming foods and whatnot in order to assist in my metabolic activities. All of these are ways that the body, which in the humanist discourse is some sort of abstract entity, is in fact material and constantly invoking that which and dependent upon that which is not human. So the eco-critic is really going to help us widen our gaze beyond the human to all sorts of other entities which are critical subjects in our ethics. So that being said, I hope that this has given you a sort of holistic view into the different disciplines that are using posthumanism to their advantage, the way that they approach humanism and critique it from different vantage points and different perspectives, and provide us with different sort of challenges and practices by which to enact new categories, and also to resist the drawing of stark lines in the sand, the ability to be happy with marginality, with confusion, with uncertainty, flux, and liminality. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, postcolonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it really helps me to buy all of the many books necessary to give you all this content, but no pressure. Care about yourself first. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.